All right. Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to this week's or this month's or this quarter, depending on how often we actually do this Data Stewards Trends to Watch. And as I mentioned, I will go through a few issues that we have identified and that might impact data stewardship. And then we will close the recording and have a more open conversation among those that joined today. But we always hope to share this, which is why we record those sessions in the way we do it. We hope to share this with those who couldn't attend today, but have indicated that they would like to get the recording as well. So with that, next slide. What have we seen lately in terms of developments that impact data stewardship? And the first session will be somewhat kind of more pessimistic sessions because as some of you might know, a while back, we've been calling for a trend that is worrying us, the fact that we are entering what I have called a data winter. As we are having an AI summer, we actually see that many data sets that were initially open are increasingly closed. And unfortunately, that data winter has not got any better. Next slide. Because what we are seeing, first of all, of course, which I think is kind of the first major geopolitical development, which is, of course, the arrival of the Trump administration that not only has an impact on tariffs, which, of course, is being announced today as part of kind of Liberty Day here in the US. Also, it doesn't have the Trump administration not only has had an impact on also the decline of many alliances, whether this is the transatlantic alliance or the alliance with neighboring countries like Canada or even Mexico. But one of the major impact of the Trump administration has actually been on the availability of data. And what we have seen here within the US is actually a massive crackdown on the availability of data, both in terms of official data, like the data that was typically provided on statistical. Can we keep the slide, please? On statistical offices, but also impact on, for instance, websites. And as you might see, I think there are about 1,000 websites that now have disappeared. So if you could go back to the slide, please, Natalia. Thank you. So 1,000 websites have disappeared, but also the whole statistical system is being undermined, both in terms of, for instance, getting rid of expert advisory groups to the Census Bureau, but also whole sectors that have been cut in terms of, for instance, the education statistics basically are being cut as we speak, so that we have no comparative understanding anymore on performance in the education system across the US, but also even data, for instance, with regard to atomic measurement data that informs many other fields as well. And so that's kind of a first element that we cannot just ignore from a data stewardship perspective, is that actually what we have been considering like official statistics as kind of a bedrock that was secured and that had a common understanding that this was important, has totally been shaken by what is happening in the kind of current Trump administration, where not only data is disappearing, but what everyone fears, data might increasingly become manipulated as well, right? Where we actually don't have an understanding of what is actually official statistics anymore. Can we actually trust the data that is being presented and so on? And so that's kind of the first, I would say, trend, which unfortunately not only might, of course, happen within the US, but also might receive copycats worldwide, where it is obvious that, for instance, the statistical system is very easy to dismantle or starve from funding so that we actually don't have that ground truth anymore as well. Next slide. But it's not only at the level of official statistics, and it's not only at the level of official data that increasingly is disappearing with the US. Next slide. We also see trends elsewhere as well. And the first one here is an interesting article that appeared, I think, this week in the Conversation, where two authors who are associated with World Pop are basically ringing the alarm bell that population data is also disappearing or is in crisis. And as you know, especially if we want to start leveraging non-traditional data, we still need to quite often ground truth that data. And in order to ground truth the data, we actually need official census data, because census data basically allows us to understand what is the reality on the ground based upon kind of the global understanding of where populations actually live. And as you know, population data and census data is extremely important because quite often it also determines what region gets what kind of funding, right? And if you don't have an adequate census, it's very hard to know where people live, how many resources you allocate for those regions that might have a particular kind of needs. And as a result, if you're invisible, it becomes even harder to actually receive the funding that you should receive or the resources that you should receive. And basically, what the authors are indicating is that it gets harder and harder to actually conduct censuses that are solid, that are complete, and that are kind of reliable as well. And that's in part because of the fact that we have massive survey fatigue, right? And so it goes back to kind of, we need to upgrade and update our methodologies to actually collect data. And as a result of the survey fatigue that we see, we actually get more and more challenges with actually getting high quality data because people just don't fill in the survey, or they refuse to take part of the census, or the answers they give to the census is not that reliable as well. And in addition to, of course, the challenges with survey fatigue, we also have seen a decrease in funding for census, because a census is extremely expensive. But of course, many countries have budget crisis, and as a result, that automatically leads that actually, as we've seen also in the US, kind of the official statistics are the ones that then get starved from funding to actually develop this kind of baseline of the country or the baseline of a particular kind of region as well. Now, there are methods to do this, and of course, the article also points to kind of new instrumentation mechanisms, especially kind of digital ways, but at the same time, it's definitely something that from a data stewardship perspective, one has to take into account that the baseline, the ground truth upon which many of the analytics is based might actually becoming less and less reliable and less available as well. And I think that's kind of a global crisis that we need to start taking into account as well. The other data winter, and I just selected two because it's, anyway, I don't want to kind of make everyone depressed immediately. But the other element that we are seeing, which is here an article that, and actually a report that was published in MIT Technology Review, which is based upon a long-standing research done by the Data Provenance Institute. What they have identified as well is that what was typically understood as something called the public web, right, which is kind of the web that doesn't have any barriers to access. There is no CAPTCHA you have to fill in before you go to the website, or you don't have to have a password to have access to the web. That the public web is actually decreasing massively. And I think there was kind of a percentage that was quoted here, which was that they have seen the last few months a 3,000% increase in closing down the public web, right? Which has all kinds of complications with regard to, for instance, crawling, right? because, as you know, one of the biggest data sets for AI training happens to be crawled data, right? Happens to be data that basically was captured from the web, right? We have Common Crawl, we have, anyway, all kinds of other initiatives like Bright Data, for instance, that is trying to capture data from the web, but that becomes harder and harder, which also means that training data becomes scarce, which is why we are entering what is called a data scarcity environment with regard to AI training. Now, this at the same time gives an opportunity, of course, to become less extractive, because there's a lot of concern about crawling, that this might actually be an extractive practice. But at the same time, the question then is, of course, how do we make data accessible so that we actually have, again, access to public data in ways that can benefit society as well, because many of this data we cannot leverage anymore. Next slide. So that's with regard to the data winter. And then the last thing I would add here is that while there's a lot of discussion about decline in access to data, what we actually should have a discussion about is, of course, what data do we need, right? And that's why I share here the book that I think just came out today by Deanne Coyle, which is a economist at Cambridge University at the Bennett School. And so the book here is about a measure of progress, counting what really matters, which opens up again the conversation, which typically we start with in the Data Stewards Bootcamp, of course, is about how do we know what are actually the questions that matter. And so from my point of view, we can have a long discussion about the data winter and the fact that we see a decline in access to data. I think in order to start addressing it, we also need a better conversation about, well, what is the data that fundamentally we need, right? And how do we make sure that we count what matters? And I think that is kind of what Diane is arguing as well, is that many of the current indicators that are being used actually are old indicators, don't take into account recent developments, and that we really need to update our kind of indicators of measuring society. And of course, one of them is kind of the GDP, of course, as well. But it relates also to, of course, the work that we've been doing with regard to developing a new science of questions, which is why I also share here the paper that we recently published, which was based upon some of the work that I've been doing with regard to development of a new science of questions. Basically, the last few months, I've been convening a committee on establishing a new science of questions, which involved a whole interesting group of people. Some of them were philosophers, some of them came out of the curiosity science, some of them were kind of individuals that call themselves questionologists. And so what we tried to do was to basically tap into their collective wisdom, and the outcome was the need for kind of a Q-lab, which we are developing further, which is somewhat similar to, some of you might know, the Stanford D-School, which was fundamentally important for introducing design thinking in the world. Basically, what this committee argued is that we need something similar to advanced question science in order to really understand what actually should be measured and to understand what really matters as well. And so it relates to kind of what we've been discussing in the Data Stewards course, of course, as kind of the step number one of the canvas as well. But it becomes only more as we see data disappearing to be able to then really pronounce what data we need. And that can only be done through kind of this new science of questions. Next slide. And I go a little bit faster because, again, I realize I'm kind of very long-winded, which is kind of my disease. So it leads us to kind of the fourth wave of open data. Some of you, of course, know, next slide, that the fourth wave of open data is really about where open data and Gen AI meet. And within that context, of course, one of the big arguments has been is that we need to move from just open data to actually also increased data commons. And data commons is becoming kind of the new field that many organizations are advancing or are advocating for, which basically is a kind of a new way of providing access to data that is not fully open, but is aligned with community preferences and expectations, right? Which also is linked to what I will discuss later. It's kind of a social license driven approach. And here, what I'm sharing, again, some propaganda is kind of a blueprint that we recently developed to really start developing data commons, which basically goes through kind of the steps that are needed to actually establish data commons that can be used for AI. But one of the key elements, of course, to make open data ready for AI means that we actually also need to start thinking about what does it mean to be AI ready, right? And that's the other element here that I share is that another paper that we published this month was to really start thinking about AI ready data and to start advancing what I call, and some of you know, because I've been calling that lately, is to actually extend the FAIR principles. And the FAIR principles, of course, are the principles that focus on findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, right? Which are kind of the fundamental principles that have underpinned open science and are still very important. But we need to add an R, which is kind of the ready for AI kind of element as well. And I think that's all part of kind of the fourth wave of open data, where we need to start thinking about new ways of accessing data, like data commons, but also start to expand our notion of reusability, because it also has to be reusable for AI as well. Next slide. That also was recognized in a paper that was published with the Open Source Initiative and Open Future, which was the result of a convening in Paris, where I also took part, which really advocates, if we want to have open source AI, which is the other, of course, big topic that has emerged lately, is kind of the embracement of open source AI. And we can have a long discussion what we mean by that. But at least the Open Source Initiative has come up with a definition that goes beyond open weighing. But the key message there is that in order to advance open source, we also need open data. But it's not just open data as we know, it's actually really about data commons that would enable access to different types of data sources. Because again, the fourth wave is not just about tabular data, it's also about unstructured data. It's about data that has different kinds of formats that also needs to be made open as well. And then the other element that I selected here is where we can see the use of Gen AI to also advance data quality. And there's a lot of interesting work in that. And again, if I would have more time, I would go deeper into kind of the advances in actually starting to use AI to enhance and enforce what quite often is called data contracts. Because what is happening now is that you can actually develop a data contract which basically specifies this is the quality we want and we need, and that then gets enforced through AI by kind of reviewing the data that is fed to the model. And before it's fed to the model, AI screens the data and sees whether it actually aligns with those kind of data quality requirements. And so automatically, you kind of have a way to rapidly improve the quality of the data based upon this kind of data contract that is embedded in the system as well. And there's a lot of advances here as well. Similar, Gen AI is increasingly used also for data discovery, which is another exciting field of the fourth wave of data, where you can actually start using Gen AI to discover data, for instance, within government, right? Because again, there's a lot of data within government. Most of the time you don't know. Quite often in the past, you had to develop data catalogs, which took forever, but you can actually start using Gen AI to start discovering data that could be relevant for data to be made open as well, which is another fourth wave of open data development. Next slide. Here I would, anyone who is interested in kind of the fourth wave, but also on how you should start thinking about unlocking open data. Here I really recommend what the US Department of Commerce has done before, of course, the Trump administration. It's actually still available, which is why I would recommend you quickly go and download the piece before it disappears. They developed in January, they released this kind of set of guidelines, which was based upon a long consultation that took place in the US that was hosted by the Department of Commerce to really start understanding how do we make open data AI ready, right? How do we make sure that open data is actually used for Gen AI? Because that was one of the key concerns they had, is that much of the open data was never used for Gen AI, and as a result, Gen AI didn't reflect official data, and as a result, was actually less important in that context as well. And so I really suggest, if you're interested in that, to check out the document here. And they also provide a whole range of guidelines, both guidelines in terms of how to improve documentation of data, guidelines in terms of how do you come up with new metadata formats, guidelines with regard to kind of storage, but also licensing and data quality and integrity. And so here, I would really recommend for the data stewards on the call to really, anyway, check that out. Next slide. And see how it's relevant in your context. The other big thing, next slide, that keeps coming back is, of course, the need for a new licensing regime that embeds people's expectations and preferences, right? And this is kind of the social license, as you know, that we've been working on for a while in order to really provide access to data that aligns with people's expectations and preferences. And here I just shared two documents. One was kind of a new paper that came out over the weekend, which was super interesting. That kind of was a case study, because we don't see that many case studies, to be quite honest, on how non-traditional data was used and what was kind of the reaction from society. And so this was a case study on Norway statistics that try to have access to billing data in order to improve their economic statistics. And ultimately, it led to a total storm of reactions in Norway of people that were concerned on how that data would be used, which indicates that, anyway, if you start using non-traditional data, it's very important to obtain the social license for doing so, because without it, you might actually have this kind of protest and you might actually undermine the initiative and have a setback for a long time. And then the other piece that I share here was developed by the Open Knowledge Foundation, but also researchers in France who have done quite a lot of work on thinking about the need for new data licensing. And again, highly recommend the paper that basically focuses on the limitations of today data licensing regimes within the context of AI, where most of the licensing basically gets ignored, and especially that most of the new licensing that are being recommended only take intellectual property rights into account, which is still very important. But of course, as we all know, ownership, property within the data context is a very complicated topic. And more importantly, if you only focus on intellectual property rights, you're not going to take into account people's expectations and preferences with regard to data that they might have provided in the first place as well. And so that's why there's, again, and the paper also makes reference to our work on social license that I think becomes more important as well. Next slide. And here a few other things, which again, the question is, of course, how do you establish that social license? And this is kind of a paper that I developed together with Claudia Schwartz from Democracy Next within the context of the Paris AI Summit. because the Paris AI Summit was all about global governance. And as you know, and there was also suggestions to create a global citizens assembly. Unfortunately, those global efforts are very important, but quite often very limited in terms of impact and also very hard to establish. And that's also why, anyway, we've been advocating for actually establishing social license more at the local level, like the city level, where you can actually have a better engagement. We also had an event during the Paris AI Summit where we actually invited several French cities because it was organized with Urban AI. And again, the issue of really engaging citizens at the local level with regard to how their data can be used for AI or even issues of AI governance becomes more important. And of course, this also becomes even more important because many countries are now looking into kind of setting up national data libraries, or as in Germany, of course, and would be interesting to hear Oliver and Katharina perhaps reflect on that as well, national data institutes. But then what's the role of those institutes or those libraries to actually also make sure that they have the social license for providing access to data, which is kind of an element that quite often is not recognized as well. Next slide. Then next slide, there are a whole range of issues at the global level, of course. One thing, and again, I apologize for so much propaganda this week, but one element is about do we need a universal data principles? And so this is a paper that just came out, which basically goes into kind of three categories of universal data principles that, if accepted, would limit fragmentation, because it turns out that fragmentation, while of course it takes into account contextualization, but fragmentation also has a major impact on the possibility for cross-border data sharing, as, by the way, this new report by the OECD is also pointing to. And so what this paper and what we've been trying to do at the level of the CEB, which is the kind of the coordinating body across UN agencies, is to come out with kind of universal data principles, which are categorized in three clusters. One is value, other one is trust, and the other one is kind of equity. And really starting to think about how do we, across those principles, how do we start creating some kind of common understanding that these are the principles that need to be enforced. As I said, fragmentation is a key issue at the global level, and this paper by the OECD actually does some kind of an economic analysis where they indicate that fragmentation could reduce global GDP, data fragmentation could reduce global GDP by 4.5%. And if we would figure this out, it would actually increase global GDP by 1.7%, which is why cross-border data sharing, my view is that cross-border data sharing is going to become more important as a data governance topic that needs to be addressed. No one has really figured this out, except at a bilateral level, where you have kind of data sharing agreements across countries. And of course, in the current geopolitical environment, it might become even harder to actually establish kind of global agreements on this kind of cross-border data sharing, especially when you cannot trust how the data eventually might be used in kind of a context that previously was seen as safe, but have become more complicated and challenging as well. Next slide. And then, anyway, the other interesting piece that I wanted to share was that there's a lot of thinking about AI as kind of distinctive. And as some of you know, I've always been arguing that ultimately AI is kind of a form of data governance, that we not should just think about AI governance as something separate. But I also highly recommend this piece by Milton Mueller, who basically kind of tries to reframe AI as just distributed computing, right? And that we should not approach AI as kind of a distinctive, completely new field that requires distinctive new governance, but that we can actually learn from the distributed computing environments, which of course also has been informed by, for instance, distributed computing in terms of domain names, in terms of ICANN and the like, and that we can actually learn some lessons from that as well. Next slide. And then some tools that I would recommend. Again, the first one, again, some propaganda, because together with the European Commission, I've been part of developing this kind of data innovation toolkit, which some of you might be interested in. And this is mainly focused, was created for the European Commission itself, because the European Commission has actually developed and invested in something called a big data environment, where you could, it was kind of a computational environment where members of the European Commission could do data analytics. Now, it turned out that having access to computation is, of course, not enough. You actually need to understand how you go about framing a problem, how you go about understanding the data lifecycle. And that's basically what we try to do here, is to provide kind of a toolkit on how you start leveraging data within the context of the Commission, but now it's also made publicly available, which is why I share it here as well, that others can start using as well. And then again, no surprise for the data stewards here on the call. You will see that we are start using the kind of the data lifecycle, where we have different kinds of tools that are made available for kind of leveraging data. Next slide. The other thing I would highlight here is that the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data also released a new toolkit or a roadmap, which basically was developed by Sim Esco, who of course is a kind of an expert on accessing mobile phone data. And so this is kind of a roadmap to accessing mobile network data for statistics, but can also be used, of course, for other purposes as well, and could be interesting for those that are interested in accessing non-traditional data as well. And again, a lot of this, as you will see, relates to the canvas of the data stewardship canvas, where anyway, we discuss similar kind of things, but this is then particularly focused on the mobile network data as well. Next slide. And then next slide, there are always a few use cases that might be of interest, where you can get inspired by accessing non-traditional data. I'm not going to go into detail here, but for instance, anyway, there's a lot, and we will, again, we're working on something that we will release soon, where we will share kind of X amount of use cases for access social data for improving health and well-being. But these are kind of also use cases where access to human mobility data, you can actually understand urban inequalities in a much better way. And also here, I thought this was kind of interesting to showcase how non-traditional data can also be used for public transportation management as well. Next slide. And also, interestingly enough, satellite data. And that, by the way, is kind of one category of data that becomes more and more important, mainly because the quality of the data becomes better, of course, but also because cities finally are starting to leverage satellite data in a much better way to understand, for instance, mobility, but also climate impact and so on. And here are two kind of initiatives. One is kind of more a call for initiatives, but at least it shows that there is kind of increased interest on how satellite data can be used for improving urban conditions as well. And it's a kind of a category that needs to be leveraged more as kind of a category that can be used. Next slide, at the urban level. So with that, I'm gonna stop here. These are just a few trends. And as I said, we started off with kind of the emerging data winter, but then also evolutions in terms of what we mean by open data and access to data, especially at the time of AI. And then hopefully also giving you some examples that indeed access to data can start answering questions that otherwise are very hard to answer in terms of urban inequalities and the like as well. So we're gonna perhaps stop recording here. And again, this is enough